Reimagining Beloved Community, Part 1. My message today is actually based on this book. I hope you can see it in the camera here. It's by the Reverend Adam Russell Taylor, of whom I just read that letter. It's called A More Perfect Union, A New Vision for Building the Beloved Community. Now, it actually was recommended to me by Lori Robson. I had never heard of it before. And she's our congregation's representative with Joshua, which is the Interfaith Justice Organization in Green Bay. And Joshua has chosen this book as a common read for discussion earlier this spring and into the summer. I guess the last discussion is the end of this month. I'm looking forward to it now that I've done this sermon. So I decided to create this into a two-part series on the book and turn it into kind of a summer read. So today is June 9th, and I'm going to talk about the first half of Taylor's book, which he actually divides into two parts, chapter 1 through 8. And it's really about he makes the case for the new vision and the building blocks for doing so. Then, because Lori and my schedules don't jive very well, we're going to do a book discussion here. So I hope after I give you this morning, you're going to be fired up to read this. And we're going to have July 31st, it's a Wednesday, 6:30 to 8:30 right here. We're going to have a book discussion about it. And then the second sermon is coming August 25th because of the way the schedule worked out. So we've got this whole summer to think about this book. Now, at first that seemed crazy, but then I thought about it. It's all about America and building a more perfect union. And we are in the middle of the season of patriotism, right? You've got Memorial Day weekend, Labor Day weekend, the 4th of July. Next week is Flag Day, and Appleton has the largest Flag Day parade in the country. So, you know, we've got a lot going on, and it seemed to make sense to have this book be part of the read. And it's a very laid-back, casual way to do it. It's not a very thick book, so I invite you to join us in that this summer. Now, let me give you a little background. Taylor's reason for writing the book. It basically was outlined in that letter to his sons. He wrote that first, and from that came this book. So you just heard a summary of the whole thing. I can sit down and we can sing the final hymn, I guess. But the background was in 2016 in that election, if you recall, we were up very, very late, not really knowing who won. And I don't know what time zone, I think they're on the Eastern time zone. But he said their oldest son, who I think was 7, 8 at the time, came into their bedroom at 3 in the morning, and he wanted to know who won. And of course, they had to tell him that Donald Trump won, and he was kind of dumbfounded and very confused, because if you grow up in a very religious family, you're going to talk about moral values all the time. So I'm sure there was a lot of editorializing going on during that election. And so this little boy was kind of confused how somebody that had those kind of values could have become president. So when we got to the 2020 election and things were still in flux for a couple of days, he felt that he hadn't done a good job the first time around and decided to sit down, because now he had 4 years to think this through and write this more complete letter to both his sons. And actually it was written to his younger son, who then was 7. So essentially, Taylor believes emphatically that Martin Luther King Jr. had it right. The term beloved community is what we really need to go after. Now, we want to make sure, because it's used a lot, and Martin Luther King Jr. used the term a lot, but let's give credit where credit is due. The term was actually created by a philosopher theologian, Josiah Royce, and was used by the leaders in a group called the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which was an interfaith organization that was founded in 1915. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. became a member of it eventually and was very familiar with the concept. And so he's the one that used the term over and over again and actually popularized it. And it was pointed out that he never actually did a speech or a sermon called The Beloved Community. Let me tell you about it. He just referred to it a lot. And so you kind of got the idea of what he was talking about. But essentially, he described it as a vision of total interrelatedness, the solidarity of all humans living in a collective destiny. He used the term a lot, agape love, meaning that a love that applies to all, worthy or not worthy, was not part of the equation there. And famously, he believed that nonviolence was the key towards building such a community. Now, the responsive reading that we use from his wife, Coretta Scott King, was written later, where she was kind of laying out really this is what beloved community is about. So I want to start actually with an assessment of Taylor's message. I think the book is really well written. It really draws me in. It's very interesting. And it really is a narrative. He has this really profound point he wants to make, and then he follows it with lots and lots and lots of stories that are very interesting. He's lived most of his life in the center of politics and justice seeking, so he's got a lot of very interesting things to say. However, much of what he writes is a very well-worn path among progressives, and including many Unitarian Universalists. And I was speaking to Lori this morning, and she kind of felt the same thing. Through chapters 1 through 7, I started this on a plane on the way home from a vacation, and I found myself thinking, yep, got it, yep, already know that, yep, okay. And then I kind of like got off the plane, I'm like, okay, and what? You know, what's going on next? So I was a little bit disappointed because the way this is written, a more perfect union, a new vision for building beloved community, I expected it to be sort of this profound thinking that takes us somewhere else. So it's very good. If you're not as familiar with it as those of us that kind of live and breathe this are, I highly recommend it. And I kept thinking that until I got to chapter 8. And then my whole world lit up, and I thought of a lot of possibilities. So today, as I summarize, if you're kind of nodding your head going, just hang in there with me until we get to chapter 8, and let's talk about that together. And that's another reason I want to do the book discussion, because I'd love to hear your reactions. Maybe I'm overreacting. So let's get started. Taylor's new vision for building the beloved community. Part 1, it's 4 chapters and 4 chapters. Part 1 and 2 I'm talking about today. The first is his vision. He goes right into, here's my vision of beloved community. And the first chapter nails it, embracing a bigger story of us. It's a very profound question he asks. What is America's shared story? A true story that we all can accept. So essentially, he doesn't say it quite in the first chapter, but if you read a little bit further, he's asking a question, what is the counter to the Make America Great Again story? Which is a not so subtle reference to a story of white Christian nationalism from some fantasy period in the past where supposedly everything was perfect for a few people. So he's asking, what is a story where we can have that can absorb all the pain, the hardship, and the tragic suffering of our past and reconcile it into a stronger, more unified vision of ourselves. So that's chapter 1. That's a good one. He follows it up with chapter 2 with a chapter titled Why America Must Be Reborn. Now this is where he's a Baptist minister, so he goes into his Baptist theology about rebirth. You know, if you know anything about Baptist theology, they believe in adult baptism. So it's all about, you are an adult now, are you going to accept being reborn into the church and that kind of thing. So this is the language that he uses. And he says that America needs to be reborn through forgiveness and reconciliation. There's so much wrong, not anywhere close to the beloved community. And he says it will take the energy of those good old-fashioned Christian revivals to accomplishment. This is a quote from him. Our nation's rebirth will require coming to terms with our past and making amends while we embrace a new set of commitments for the future. If we remain steadfast in claiming and living out our best religious and civic ideals, we can and shall overcome. He also points out that in America's history, there's always been a role for religious organizations to have a moral voice. If you think back, go back to the abolitionist movement, there was very strong religious voice driving that. And most of the big changes that have come across in America over the centuries were driven by religious organizations. Now, he admits that religion doesn't have the power that it once had, but he says we still have a moral voice in America and we need to use it. And And he gives us a quote, some thinking from Martin Luther King Jr. about the appropriate prophetic role of faith organizations. Now remember, King was also a Baptist minister. He uses the word church here, but I would equally substitute any faith organization, religious organization. He said, the church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state, but rather the conscience of the state. It must be the guide and critic of the state and never, ever its tool. If the church does not recapture its prophetic zeal, it will become an irrelevant social club without moral or spiritual authority. Excuse me, that was written 60 years ago. So Taylor brings it up because this is where he begins to introduce, he takes a stab a lot at the Christian right. And the fact that the Christian right has allied themselves very strongly with political party and government. And he said that is not the role, and that's a very dangerous place to go. Chapter 3, it's titled E Pluribus Unum, out of many one. Now many of you probably know that before the communist scare, the godless communists were going to take over the world, we had a different motto on our dollar. It wasn't in God we trust, it was E Pluribus Unum, out of the many one, which Taylor argues should be our motto. That's what we should be lifting up. Now again, let's give credit where credit is due. That phrase comes from a Roman statesman and philosopher, Cicero. And Cicero actually said, when each person loves the other as much as himself, it makes one out of many. There's a little nuance to something maybe Jesus said. Taylor, here's a quote from him again. He says, our oneness is not found in a single culture or a single language or a single place of origin like Northern Europe, but rather in our shared ideals, shared values, shared aspirations, as well as our commitment to love the other as much as ourselves. Our diversity is our strength. He goes on to chapter 4, really reimagining this beloved community. His definition is to build a nation in which neither punishment nor privilege is he uses the word viciously, is viciously attached to one's race, skin color, gender, ethnicity, nationality, or sexual orientation and gender identity. Living up to these standards would mean that every person would be equally valued and respected, and that their dignity would be affirmed. When I read that, I immediately, of course, thought of the Unitarian Universalist principles. It's pretty much the same language. Then he goes on to say, the beloved community cannot be defined around what shouldn't happen. It must also be defined around a positive vision of a preferred future. He unpacks the word beloved. What does that really mean? It's what we most cherish and value. It's a commitment to empathy. He says it's a community in which we are constantly seeking to build and restore right relationships. It's when the most marginalized among us can flourish. So his concept is that beloved community would become the central focus of American society, and it's an ideal that we all agree we're going to live into. It doesn't mean we live in la-la land and there's never any, conflict or disharmony, but we acknowledge it and do everything we can to bring everybody back into right relationship. That's the kind of community he's talking about, that this is what we have front and center in our lives. He says the beloved community then acts as a moral compass in the same way that the Hebrew prophets did for Israel back in the day, or the early Christian church leaders before it became the Christian Empire of Rome. The early church leaders were all about that, or the 20th century ethos of the civil rights leaders. So that's his part one, laying out his vision of what beloved community looks like. The building blocks of beloved community I won't dwell on as long because they're pretty straightforward and pretty stark. What stands in the way of us getting there? His first one in chapter 5 is Unmasking America's Myths. He cites 5 myths, and he's actually quoting Richard T. Hughes in a book or an article called Myths America Lived By. Number 1, the myth of a chosen nation. The notion that God Almighty chose the United States for a special mission in the world. Number 2, the myth of nature's nation. The conviction that American ideals and institutions are rooted in the natural order, that is, in God's own intentions, first revealed at the dawn of civilization. You gotta laugh, but these are real. That leads to number 3, the myth of the millennial nation. That notion that the United States, building on that natural order, will usher in a final golden era for all humankind. Number 4, the myth of a Christian nation. The claim that America is a Christian nation, consistently guided by Christian values. And finally, number 5, the myth of the innocent nation. The conviction that the nobility of the American cause always redeems the nation and renders it innocent. I mean, these sound like outrageous, but if you think about manifest destiny and the doctrine that's been around since the 1800s and how it gave us permission to just take over the whole continent, it stems from all of this. So that's number 5. Those are some pretty hard myths to overcome in this society because they are deeply ingrained. Number 6, telling the whole truth to set us free. Basically, he says, America's founding was grounded in white supremacy. And therefore, the dominant narrative that we know is a whitewashed version of the story. And he goes on into example after example to example, but all attempts at a more truthful narrative have fueled polarization. So chapter 7, of course, is overcoming toxic polarization. He starts out by saying, it's sad that we have simply accepted toxic polarization as the new norm. He said, even on both sides, the only agreement that we even have is that it's getting worse. So he says, of course, the beginning of overcoming it is understanding what drives it. Okay, this is in the media all the time. We talk about it, we read about it, we hear about it all the time. One-sided news sources, social media, politics driven by money and gerrymandering. And my computer just went away, sorry. I don't know what I touched. Oh, I know what it is. Never mind. When you push the button when you push your screen up to the top, it shuts it off. All right, so one-sided news sources and politics driven by money and gerrymandering feeds the attention-getting divisiveness. Because if you're a politician, come on, and you need to get more money, you need to scream louder and say more outrageous things on both sides to get anybody to give you money and pay attention. So it kind of feeds on itself. Think about it. He points out moderate politicians are kind of a scarce thing these days. So he had a suggested solution and a role for religious organizations that is a little interesting, and I hadn't thought of it. He actually uses a quote from Rachel Kleinfeld, who's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Talks about social trust is a nation's immune system. We have to have social trust to make sure that we can get through things when things go awry, right? So he says, or she says, look for areas where there's cross-cutting of our identities. Areas where maybe we belong to things or are part of things, but you can have both sides of the fence, both sides of the dialogue present, because it's just natural. And the first one that she points out is religious affiliations. The second one is strong ties to a location. And it's essentially, I'm repeating myself, helping people come together around identities that are not polarized. And I thought about that, wait a minute, we've just been talking about the religious right and how they've been tied to politics, and now you're suggesting that churches are some place where you can do that? And I think back, maybe the churches of yore, maybe when my parents grew up, that you had people from all the political spectrum attending services because the churches weren't very political. It was all about worshiping something. So with that advice comes a big caution. And he goes in for a long time talking about a criticism of Christian nationalism and reinforcing that religion should focus on values, not politics. I won't go into it this morning any more than I already have. And finally, we get to chapter 8, which I really liked, Redeeming Patriotism. Because when I was a kid, we were one of those families that had this flagpole in the ground with a circle of flowers around it. We made sure that they were red, white, and blue petunias, although there aren't blue petunias, you had to use purple. And it was my job every day as a little kid to put up that flag and take it down. And I was very proud of it. And my family I had one parent was a Democrat, one was a Republican. They were both moderate. They laughed that they'd cancel each other out at every election. But that was just, the way America worked. And I was very, very proud of it. And as I grew up and became an adult, you get a little bit more cynical and you learn that things aren't quite as idyllic as you thought they were. And so I've really realized I've put that whole patriotism thing in the background because I don't know what to do with it. And I know there's a lot of people that proudly fly flags, and I don't know the background of everybody in my neighborhood who flies a flag, but I know a lot of them do it because it's now somehow become a statement for conservatives, that they own the flag somehow, or at least that's how I feel. It's probably not true. But so that's why I found this chapter particularly interesting. It starts right out with the statement, nationalism is not patriotism. And it talks about how there's a lot of very nationalistic kind of dialogue going on right now and activities. And every time someone tries to push back against it, they get just bombarded that they're not patriotic. And it makes things very confusing in the dialogue that we're having here. And Taylor uses a Charles de Gaulle quote that says, patriotism is when love of your own people comes first. Nationalism is when hate for people other than your own comes first. And we're still talking about people that are in the same country, Americans. So are you patriotic because this is out of the many one, it's all about all of us? Or are you nationalistic because you tend to come from a very specific slice of this country and it's all about your people and not the other people that maybe aren't like you? Well, healthy patriotism, love for the ideals of one's country with an ongoing commitment to fully realize them is what he's talking about. Fully realizing a society that has equal justice under the law, commitment to liberty and justice for all. So redemptive patriotism, finally, is claiming these values and proclaiming it loudly to the world when we do miss the mark. And redemptive patriotism is also standing up for those that proclaim this. And he uses the example of the Take a Knee movement in the NFL and how it was brutally pushed back against. And then after a while, the commissioner decided that Black Lives Matter was a good thing, and the NFL came out in support of it. So it's sort of one of those, why do we persecute the messenger here, right? That's what he's trying to get at. So the takeaway for me, for us, for the first half of this book, is that I think Unitarian Universalists need to redeem patriotism and be a lot more overt about it. Maybe you're not as scared about it as I am or have been, but I think we should do more. I should do more. I believe that this type of patriotism perfectly applies to our Unitarian Universalist faith. We are a value-driven faith, not a doctrinal faith. And our values are absolutely in alignment with the goals of the beloved community. We need to stop letting the MAGA folks have a monopoly on what is perceived as American patriotism, but really this poorly disguised Christian nationalism. So I'm going to end with a fairly long, patriotic, inspirational call to take up the challenge that to me would be the kind of patriotism I'd love to see. It's right out of the book. America. Where at our best we have defended human rights and sowed seeds of democracy around the world, even if at times done unevenly or counterproductively. America, I love your multiculturalism and diversity, where you can almost see the entire world reflected in so many of our cities. America, I love that you have provided refuge and solace for some of the world's most persecuted, and oppressed people, even if this commitment has been halting. America, I love the genius of your entrepreneurship and inventiveness, the scholarship and excellence of American higher learning. America, I love the beauty and breadth of your landscapes. America, I love the music and art forms you have invented, the brilliance of jazz, hip-hop, rock and roll, and country. America, I love your pioneering democratic system of checks and balances, divided government, and constitutional rights. And despite your major setbacks, I love your ongoing march towards forming a more perfect union and becoming a more inclusive and just democracy. These are just some of the reasons to preserve this country, to celebrate it, to strengthen it. And then in my words, and may we someday just as proudly declare, America, the beloved community. May it be so. Let's pause for a minute.